makes the Mind Flayer the most dangerous monster on Stranger Things, and what is its final goal? How a surprising thing like puberty inspired the look of this monstrous creature? And finally, will it return in Season 4? Hi, I'm Dylan, and right now we're gonna break it all down. What is the Mind Flayer? In the first season of Stranger Things, we are horrified by the show's original monster, the Demogorgon. The name that the boys gave to the creature comes straight out of the Dungeons & Dragons monster manual. But it turns out that the Demogorgon wasn't the ultimate threat for the kids of Hawkins, and, in perspective, for humanity at large. The main villain on Stranger Things is the monstrous Mind Flayer. In the board game, these creatures don't look like towering spiders made of body parts, but there are definitely some similarities to the monsters in the series. In D&D, Mind Flayers are described as creatures that have tentacles protruding from their face and tend to consume humanoid brains. Mind Flayers communicate through telepathy, operate in a hive mind, and use their psionic powers to dominate the minds of their victims. And although the origins of these unique creatures are unclear, in Dustin's words,
"It's so ancient that it doesn't even know its true home."
Sound familiar, right? So why the Mind Flayer is the most dangerous monster? Although the Mind Flayer isn't the first monster we meet in Stranger Things, the show's creators, Ross and Matt Duffer, intended to introduce it from the very start. Moreover, they wanted the viewers to feel how terrifying it is, especially in comparison to other pretty scary creatures. That's why the Demogorgons and Demodogs, which seemed to be the real danger at the beginning of the show, eventually appeared to be merely the Mind Flayer's minions. But the Duffer brothers didn't want them to just be ordinary predators. They drew their inspiration from Steven Spielberg himself. "We always saw the Demogorgons as sharks, like the shark in Jaws," Ross Duffer explained. "That means the Demogorgons were more like animals, acting on instinct, grabbing their prey and dragging them back into their lair." And next, the Duffers wanted to create something truly sinister that would be scarier than just an animal, no matter how terrible it looks. What we really wanted to do to up the stakes is create something sentient. They needed something outworldly that would be able to think and strategize. So when they came across the Mind Flayer in Dungeons & Dragons mythology, it was exactly what they were thinking of. The monster who was capable of making life a living hell for the Stranger Things heroes. Why does the Mind Flayer look that gross? In Season 3 of Stranger Things, the Duffer brothers took inspiration from the horror masters, like John Carpenter, David Cronenberg, and George Romero. And the Mind Flayer creature, which is composed of gelatinous flesh complete with spidery legs and tentacle mouths, took a lot from The Thing by John Carpenter. We wanted to do something fleshy this year, and something with teeth and wet and heavy, visual effects supervisor Paul Graff revealed. That's why the Mind Flayer looks like a thrown-together, nasty Frankenstein's monster-like creature. But that's not the whole story. The fact is that the biggest inspiration behind the biggest villain in Stranger Things was actually puberty. The writer and story editor for Stranger Things, Kate Treffry, revealed that she'd reflected on the process of the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly, and it appeared to be not as beautiful as it seemed. When a caterpillar builds its chrysalis, its body dissolves into goo, and then the DNA gets rearranged into a completely different thing. And that's exactly the way the Mind Flayer got its yucky body in our dimension. Surprisingly for her, it also reminded her of an awkward and disturbing adolescent period. Puberty is disgusting, and it's awful, Treffry says. But no matter how strange it feels and looks, in the end, the Mind Flayer's ghastly appearance corresponds to how it looks in the Upside Down, according to Will Byers' visions. How come the Mind Flayer exists in our dimension? In Season 2, we discover that the Mind Flayer is able to possess people and spy on the gang and the world at large through their eyes, as it did to Will. Who could forget that moment when it was exorcised from the boy in the form of a stream of shadowy smoke? And this part of the Shadow Monster, like it was called at the time, was in Hawkins after 11 closed the gate to its dimension. So the super evil sentient monster was kind of trapped in our world, unable to summon its minions, namely the Demogorgons or Demodogs, to fulfill its evil plans. Instead, it had to use whatever was within reach, like rats. After feasting on fertilizer, the small furry animals exploded into a goo that came together to make up the body of the Mind Flayer. But it seems that the rats weren't enough. And as we already know, Billy got possessed and eventually brought enough Hawkins citizens to build a hideous body for this now interdimensional monster. By the way, the Mind Flayer possessing Billy could have happened much earlier. According to Dacre Montgomery, the showrunners had actually spoken a lot about it in season 2, and he was very aware of what was going to happen, but of course he didn't know how it would pan out. Preparing for the role, Dacre took Jack Nicholson as an example of an actor who can keep the audience on their toes, whether he's playing the archetypal villain or hero or somewhere in between. There are even several references in the show to Nicholson and Stephen King. Remember the scene in the sauna test episode? The moment when Billy smashes through the glass window of the sauna door and tries to attack Max mirrors Jack Nicholson's infamous door breaking in the classic horror movie The Shining. Dacre Montgomery also did a lot of work researching people who suffer or live with those conditions, like dissociative identity disorder, in order to properly portray Billy's possession. What does the Mind Flayer want? The second season of Stranger Things ended with the gang victorious, although unaware of the fact that they didn't eliminate the monster and a part of it was still hiding somewhere in the Brimborn Steelworks factory. But what's even worse, the Shadow Monster has now identified the person who has enough powers to confront and even destroy it. It wasn't aware of 11, and now it very much is, Ross Duffer confirmed in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. So the major goal of the Mind Flayer throughout Season 3 is getting its true enemy and killing her off. With nobody in its way, the monster is free to proceed with its evil plan, which is, presumably, wiping out the rest of mankind and invading Earth. That's why it throws all of its resources into building up this gross spider-like body out of a human-rat mismatch. How does the Mind Flayer operate? Without access to its home dimension, the Mind Flayer had to get crafty and find a way to act without using the Demogorgons. Instead, this powerful entity begins to flay other living beings. The Mind Flayer seems to communicate telepathically with Billy and forces him to bring more and more human hosts. The infected people, or the Flayed, get weaponized as they dissolve into a liquefied goo of guts and bones that later forms one gigantic Mind Flayer. And although the Flayed are aware of what happens to the other members of their horde, killing any of these individual Flayed doesn't harm the Mind Flayer itself. You might remember at least one of the moments that proves this. After confronting 11, Billy returns to his Flayed coworker Heather and says, "She could have killed me." And Heather replies, "Yes, but not us." This also hints that the Flayed are connected to each other, mentally and physically. When any of the Flayed is killed, it turns into a goo that eventually crawls back to the large monster. By the way, it was never explained how many of Hawkins' townsfolk had been Flayed and irreversibly transformed into that nasty mixture. Taking into account the massiveness of the Mind Flayer's body, a significant part of the town may no longer be around, including most of the staff of the local newspaper. Did the Mind Flayer meet its end? In Season 3, the showrunners didn't want 11 to save the world on her own again. That is why it was Joyce and Hopper who went underground and closed the gate to the Upside Down, presumably for good. But did the Mind Flayer actually die in the Starcourt Mall? The answer is no. The most terrifying monster on Stranger Things is still alive and well. And here's why. The flesh monster was controlled by the Mind Flayer, but it wasn't the Mind Flayer itself. The original monster, with all of its outworldly brains and boiling rage, was still in the Upside Down. So when Joyce and Hopper closed the portal, they only cut the connection between the Mind Flayer and the spider monster it created as its tool. Taking into account that previously, a part of the Mind Flayer had already managed to survive outside of the Upside Down after 11 closed the gate in Season 2, it's safe to assume that its storyline is not over yet. From the trailer to Season 4, we've already learned that Hopper is alive, but what's more important is that according to the Duffer brothers, Chief Hopper will face dangers both human and other. Moreover, they've also mentioned that Season 4 is shaping up to be the biggest and most frightening season yet, with a new horror beginning to surface. We heavily suspect that in the dark dimension of the Upside Down, there are even more terrifying things than the Demogorgons and even the Mind Flayer itself. So, anything's possible. And what is your idea of the next monster villain in Stranger Things Season 4? Let us know in the comments below.